Hey there, Jamie here from Keto Save Me. Hope you're doing well, and thanks so much for tuning in. I really appreciate it. So, today we're going to talk about what to eat on a ketogenic diet and how much is recommended. So, before we get into what to eat, let's talk about the how much is recommended. Now, if you remember in our last video, we talked about these magic macro percentages, and we also talked about eating as much protein as tolerated, as little carbohydrate as necessary from nutrient-dense, fibrous vegetables, and as much fat as needed to cook for flavor and to satiety, nothing more. So let's talk about the recommendations. We recommend a 1-to-1 ratio of fat to protein. That's 1 gram of fat for every gram of protein. Now that's hardly a low-fat diet. In fact, it's anything but. The majority of your calories are coming from fat. But trying to achieve these magic macros from adding fat is not going to help you lose fat. In fact, remember, the more fat that you eat, the less body fat you're going to burn. So we recommend the 1-to-1 ratio, or perhaps even less. If you can get away with less fat and not be hungry, you should. Now, as you start to get into maintenance, you're going to have to raise that to 1.5 grams all the way to 2 grams of fat per gram of protein. So where do these recommendations come from? Well, in an interview, Stephen Finney says the following. A lightly marbled steak in terms of energy is about 50-50 protein and fat. A heavily marbled steak is 75% of calories from fat and 25% from protein. Chicken with the skin, dark meat's going to be 50-50 protein and fat, but the white meat is going to be more protein, even with the skin on. So as an energy source, it's too much protein. Unless the person is trying to lose weight and getting fat from their body's own fat stores. In other words, being on a higher fat diet because they're getting fat from their body stores. After all, many people choose a low carb diet for weight loss. For them, a diet that's moderate in protein may be high in fat because they're burning their own fat for energy. When you go on a weight loss ketogenic diet, you can eat less fat on your plate because you're burning the fat that comes from your inside. It comes from your love handles and hips and so on. Well, that's where it comes from. He says it right here. The more fat you eat, the less body fat you burn. So he goes on to say this. When burning your own body fat, it looks like it's a high protein diet. But the scales go down because the body's burning its own fat stores. But if that person loses weight and decides to stay on low carb as a maintenance diet in order to become weight stable, they need to eat a considerable amount of fat. In other words, they need to increase their fat intake, which should work fine because now their body should be very efficient at burning fat. So, we also found this study that was done by Jeff Follick, and it was a well-documented comparison of low carb to low fat diets. And he took a group of 40 individuals, put half on a low carb and half on a low fat diet. And it was called Comparison of Low Fat and Low Carbohydrate Diets on Circulating Fatty Acid Composition and Markers of Inflammation, if you want to go look it up. Anyway, the low carbers ended up eating a diet that was approximately 105 grams of protein, 98 grams of fat, and 45 grams of carbohydrates. So it's pretty close to that 1-to-1 fat to protein ratio. So I think we can all agree the 1-to-1 is a pretty good ratio. But how much is that? Well, let's talk about the first and most important macronutrient, and that's protein. Now, there's a lot of debate on how much protein you're supposed to be eating. So you see ranges out there anywhere from 1 gram or less all the way to 2 grams or more per kilogram of lean body mass. So we recommend roughly a 1.5 gram of protein per kilogram of lean body mass. We think that's adequate protein to keep you in the zone of not catabolizing any lean tissue. Now, if you're fairly active or looking to build muscle, obviously you're going to want to increase that some. Also, if you're following a zero carb protocol, we're going to want to increase that recommendation to 2 grams. Now, we get to 2 grams following the Stephenson Bellevue experiment because that's about what he ate. So I think anybody knew the zero carb diet, it was him. Now, that said, if you're diabetic, it's going to change everything for you. Achieving those levels of protein is not the easiest for you because of the blood glucose spikes, and we understand that. So in order to manage those spikes, perhaps you need to be at 1.5 grams at zero carb and 1.25 to 1 gram at very low carb. Now, we're going to be able to move those levels up over time, and we're also going to learn to mitigate those spikes by meal composition, and we'll talk about that a little later. And again, if you can tolerate more protein, by all means, you should eat more. Now remember, too much protein is not going to be converted to glucose like a lot of people believe. However, excess protein will cause excess insulin, which could be problematic for ketosis. That said, the spike that diabetics see in their blood glucose levels from eating protein is not from that reason. And it's from a very different reason. And we'll touch on that later as well. So in regards to your carbohydrate intake, if you're eating carbohydrates, we recommend 20 to 25 grams from non-fiber grams of carbohydrates. And that's going to be from your vegetables, from your seafood, or from eggs. Now again, we're looking at the non-fiber carbs that we count in that total, not the net carbs. And the reason we don't count net carbs is because that brings in a whole slew of problems with artificial sweeteners, and they all have a glycemic value to them, so they have to be accounted for. So again, 20 to 25 non-fiber carbs. So what does a ketogenic meal look like? Well, it depends. If you're very low carb, zero carb, or diabetic, the answer is going to be different. Luckily, I've experienced all three. So as a diabetic, protein is very challenging for us to eat and very problematic. And the reason for that is this. When we eat protein, it creates a glucagon response in the pancreas that should also get an equal insulin response. Unfortunately, we don't have the proper amount of insulin secreted, so we see a blood glucose spike on the meter. Okay, so that's not present in a healthy metabolism. So for a diabetic, I recommend you eat to your meter. What I mean by that is this. I like to look at 20-point spike as a norm and a 30-point spike as a maximum from your meal. Now, a lot of times you can mitigate that number, as I talked about earlier, by adding some fibrous vegetables or a little bit of fat. Now, I'm not recommending adding copious amounts of fat. I'm just talking about a little bit, enough to lessen the blood glucose spike or the insulin spike. And you may need to space your protein out over multiple meals. Just try to keep it to as few meals as possible. Again, the longer time you go between meals, the lower insulin falls. But just keep pushing that threshold in small amounts. Healing's going to happen, and eventually you're going to be able to raise the amount of protein you can eat. Myself, I've actually been able to get tighter blood glucose control by eliminating carbohydrates, by eliminating plants and going zero carb. In fact, I've gone from being able to eat a mixed meal that included 30 to 40 grams of protein and about 4 to 5 grams of non-fiber carbs and a little bit of fat to now eating well over 100 grams of protein in the same sitting with about or less of a blood glucose spike as the 30 to 40 grams. So pretty heavy, increase there. But no matter what your situation, I found something really helpful. And it's a calculator, okay, that was designed by Dr. Ted Naiman of Burn Fat Not Sugar. And it's this really neat insulin calculator where you put in the macros of the meal that you're going to eat, and it will tell you the insulinogenic value of that meal or food. I mean, it's awesome stuff. Now, it was designed based on the work that our friend Marty Kendall's doing over there at Optimizing Nutrition. Remember where you can go find all those really neat charts and graphs about the most ketogenic and or insulinogenic foods. So for some people, a ketogenic meal is going to look like this. 6 to 8 ounce marbled steak with a cup of steamed broccoli or maybe a Caesar salad. Or perhaps it could just be a 12-ounce ribeye. So we want to eat proteins that are definitely fattier cuts of meat, or beef, dark meat chicken, maybe some eggs. But the leaner cuts are okay. They're not taboo. So you can get a lighter meat chicken. I prefer actually eggs and fish and seafood. And I like, white meat chicken. But what ketoer doesn't love bacon? right? So I get to cheat a little bit so I can eat my white meat chicken wrapped in bacon, and I bake that in the oven, and so I'm getting the best of both worlds. So for vegetables, we want to look at broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, asparagus, leaf lettuce, spinach, kale. And for our zero carb friends, I understand we're not going to eat any plants, so just eat a bigger steak. It's more fun anyway. But don't fear vegetables. Now, don't eat them if you don't want to. But as Stefansson showed us, you're not going to get scurvy if you don't, and you're certainly going to continue to be healthy. But just try to keep it simple when starting out. Get your protein first. Let the fat come along for the ride, okay, in the protein that you're eating. And add a bit of fat to cook or for flavor. But that's it. Keep your fat sources to butter, coconut oil, and maybe avocado or olive oil. Just remember to avoid the frankenfoods, the low-carb products. If it says net carbs on the label, it's probably something you want to avoid. Okay? Stick to nutrient-dense whole foods. Mind your macros, and I'm not talking about percentages. I'm talking about the grams. Okay? And if you don't track, you're not going to be able to make adjustments when you hit a stall. So if you're driving down the protein and you're upping fats, adding copious amounts of fats, chasing those magic macros, that's not the right way to do it. You're going to struggle at some point losing fat. Moreover, you might start losing muscle. So if what you're doing is working, by all means keep doing it as long as you're getting adequate protein. But the bulletproof coffees and the fat bombs and adding all the other fat, trying to achieve these magic macros, you're likely sabotaging your fat loss. So the best advice I can give is eat your 1-to-1 fat to protein ratio, or even a little less fat is okay. Unless, of course, you're in maintenance, then you're going to have to eat your 2 grams of fat to 1 gram of protein. But remember, we should eat as much protein as tolerated, as little carbohydrates as needed in the form of nutrient-dense fibrous vegetables, and as much fat as needed to cook for flavor and to satiety. Nothing more. So please like us on Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel, many more videos to come. Really appreciate you stopping by and hanging out. Thank you so much. And remember, we are all individual, as such our journey, and keto saved me, and it can save you too. Thanks again, and be well.